From the sports betting capital of the world, Las Vegas, it's time for the show you can't afford to miss. The #1 weekly football preview, Wanna Bet. Get ready for valuable information, analysis, winning picks, and betting strategies. Your hosts, SEC gridiron guru Kip Keefer, and award-winning betting expert, writer, and sports editor for the Las Vegas Sun, Case Keefer. Let's go. Here's everything you need to win big. Wanna Bet.
It's time for another edition of Wanna Bet. We are glad you're on board. Welcome everybody to another football weekend. Kip Keefer, Case Keefer, at the what a location this is for us to be producing the show. We are at the Superbook at Westgate, Las Vegas, and you can see in the background just a fabulous facility. Really, I called it last week, Case, kind of the mecca for sports betting. Has been a long established area here, and they've continued to acclimate and update things. Just a great place for if you're into sports betting. Is there a better spot than this?
Yeah, I mean they kind of have everything here. A lot of times the sports books, they kind of have their clear strength. One place will have a great betting menu. One place will have a great place to watch games, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like this is one place where it really has all. You're going to be able to put a fair bet down. You're going to feel welcome. It's a great place to watch games. This is really, I'd say, one of the few places, not to put anywhere else down, that really does it all.
Well, we're excited to be here, and we're excited to have you with us. I hope you saw the show last week. If not, you can go back and catch it on our Facebook page, which is Wanna Bet, just like the name of the show. If you're a Facebook subscriber, just simply log in and like that page, and you'll have access to all of our shows that we have. And we're also developing a YouTube channel to put the whole series up. I say that because we just got into the very beginnings of the discussion last week, Case, about analytics, which covers so many different areas. But I want to focus more specifically on an area that we were just starting to get into last week when we ran out of time, and have you describe kind of your process with all this data and all these numbers. First, remind people of sort of the sources of that, and then talk about specifically what your process each week in assessing matchups. What are the most important numbers, and just give us an overview of how you use all that information.
Well, the good thing is in this day and age, all these numbers are so easy to find. There's just so many websites, so much publicly available data that you really don't have to look too hard to find numbers for everything. College football, off the top of my head, I think it's collegefootballdata.com, literally has every single category you could ever think about everything. Now, some of it's unsorted, so you have to kind of work through it, and it's not going to be laid out nicely for you, but it has from anything you could think of, yards per rush attempt, all the way up to some of the more advanced analytics like expected points added per play, which is really kind of the gold standard of analytics these days, that really gives you an idea of how efficient a team is on an every play basis. And that's just college football. NFL, there's even more. I think last week I mentioned Football Outsiders, which to me is still the best of the best that kind of pioneered this space. Pro Football Focus is probably the biggest now. They have all the way granular down to how efficient every player is. Of course, they have the player grades, but even beyond that, they have other stuff of how good they are in every area. So you don't have to dig too hard. It's easy to find this stuff. I think where it's interesting, like you said, is how do you apply this to your handicapping? Because it can be a barrage, and you want to know how do I use, what are the most important things to use. But there's just some really basic things you can do to, kind of improve your approach and kind of get an idea of how good a team really is beyond kind of the noise and the randomness that can kind of happen in a single football game.
Well, just for example's sake, let's say, just to throw one out, let's say Texas is playing Oklahoma State. You look at you've got the information assembled for those. What specific areas do you use do you focus on one team first and then compare their strengths to the other team's weaknesses? How does that work?
I really like comparing the two, especially when you're trying to come up with a number of how two teams are going to play against each other. Like I said, there's so many different levels you could do, but I guess just to start, if you're just trying to make a small improvement on your handicapping and look how two teams go against each other, I'd say one of the more basic stats that everyone can start with, I think, can understand is yards per play and yards per play against. Now, why this is important is because it narrows it down. You're going to have 80 to 90 sometime on the high end trials in a game. There's going to be so many plays, and it's really important. These big stats don't mean anything. Like, who cares if someone throws for 500 yards if they threw 50 times a game? It doesn't mean as much than if you threw for 500 times if you threw for 500 yards, and you had 20 attempts. Really, looking at what a team does per play is going to give you the biggest sample and therefore give you the best idea of how they're performing. So maybe the best team in the nation will have like 8 yards per play, which would be ridiculous. Maybe their defense is bad, though, and they're giving up 6.5 yards per play. That's still a net yard per play of 1.5. We'll say that's Texas. I know the Longhorns haven't been that good in a long time, but who knows? Maybe it's coming with Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning. Then you can look at the other team and see maybe Oklahoma State. Maybe they have a good record. They've done good in close games, but if you really boil it down to a per play basis, maybe they're gaining 6.5 yards per play but giving up 6.6. Obviously, that's a negative. That means on a per play basis, they're giving up 0.01 more yards than they gained. Usually over the course of a season, that's going to even out. I know that might not have sounded so basic, but I'm trying to start with one of the more basic, kind of easy to understand concepts. I think that's where, looking at things on a more granular level, like a per play, is a good place to start if you're looking to get more into statistics, more into how teams perform the way they do.
Well, I mean, just to throw out a couple of examples, and I'll see if you really, assign a lot of significance to these, but some that jump out at me that I think, just as watching games, are huge determining factors in outcomes are things like third down conversions and also red zone efficiency. And I guess the stats would tell you how teams are as far as defending those particular situations and how proficient other teams are in executing and having a high percentage of success. Are those stats that are really significant?
Well, right next to yards per play, I think the other super basic stat that's very important kind of ties into this. It's called success rate. It really helps you to know a team's success rate. So success rate defines a successful play by getting 50% of the needed yards on first down, 75% of the necessary yards on second down. So, of course, for example, if it's 1st and 10, you need to get 5 yards for it to be a successful play. And then 3rd or 4th down, you need to get 100%. You're needing to get a first down at that point. That's the traditional definition of success rate and kind of what's ingrained in football, the way you need to be going. So you need to look at these teams' success rate. It'll give you a really good idea of how, with mini trials, how they're performing. And you can just flip it right around and look on the defense, too. Red zone efficiency, I'd say there's a little bit more push and pull about it. Now, there's certainly some correlation that better teams will be better at red zone, but I tend to think there's a lot more randomness in red zone efficiency. There's so few trials. A lot of times I feel like a team, we see it all the time. There is a team that will really struggle in the red zone for half the year. We make a big deal about it. How will they fix this? The next half of the year, they're great. I think there's a lot of randomness in it. There is some correlation. I'm not saying there's none. But if I look at red zone and I see a team's doing terrible, I am less likely to be alarmed by that and more likely thinking they're getting unlucky and it'll turn around in time.
And again, this is also fascinating because just from all the numbers, and we'll visit this next week, but because we're out of time for this segment again. But what I really want to talk about next week is coaches themselves and the decisions they make and how you kind of weigh all that against the numbers. I know personalities come into it. This is a fascinating subject, and I hope you all are enjoying our discussion. We'll get back to it next week with more on Inside the Numbers here on Wanna Bet. For right now, we're going to find out how Case utilized those numbers this week. His best bets for college and pro football are coming up next. Stay right where you are.
Hey everybody, Kip Keefer here, filling in this week for Case Keefer, who's unfortunately on assignment and unavailable. We tried to get all of this put together so Case could give you his great information that he brings you every week, but unfortunately it's just not possible. So I'm going to be pinch hitting in the segment that he usually highlights games from around the country and NFL action. These are not Case's picks, unfortunately. These are kind of emergency Kip Keefer picks. So I want to make that clear. These if I'm right, we'll happily count them on Case's record. If they're not correct, then they should not be used against Case in a court of law. Last week, Case had a good week. He was over 500. He gave you 3 college picks and went 2-1 on those. And then in the NFL, had a 2-2 week. The Atlanta Falcons, one of his highlight picks last week. The Falcons have been the only team in the NFL thus far that have covered every single week of the season, which is kind of remarkable. And they did it again, winning outright last week as an underdog against the San Francisco 49ers. So let's get to it this week. Some good opportunities, I think, in the games around the country. Of course, I'll be along in just a moment with the SEC picks for this week. But let's start with the homecoming game. Down in Waco, Texas, the Baylor Bears are playing Case's alma mater, Kansas, the Jayhawks. And they have had a tremendous run so far this season. Of course, they have fallen the last 2 weeks to TCU, who remains undefeated. And Oklahoma finally got it together last week, but Kansas acquitted themselves well. Don't be fooled by that result. Kansas, 9-point underdog at Norman against the Sooners, only fell in that game by 10 points, so they darn near covered. They go to Baylor this week. Lance Leipold, the coach for Kansas, has them playing very well. And let's take the Jayhawks plus the 9.5 when they venture to Baylor for this weekend's game. The next stop we'll make is Duke and Miami. The Duke Blue Devils kind of quietly are a pretty good football team this year. They have been in every game. Miami has struggled mightily at times. They did finally get a win, knocking off Virginia Tech in their last game. But the bad news, I guess, in that situation is that Miami is a 9-point favorite at home, again, against a Duke team that is playing pretty good football. So we're going to go with the Blue Devils in that one and see how that goes. Okay, here's a shocker, a top 10 team. We had this in the SEC. We'll talk about it coming up in just a little bit. But you have a top 10 team in the SEC in Ole Miss, who is going to LSU, and Ole Miss coming off not a very impressive defensive performance against Auburn last week. A little shaky, to be exact. But the bottom line is, while you want to put Ole Miss on upset alert because LSU looks like it's getting things together, the problem with that is LSU, the team not undefeated and not in the top 10, is the favored team. We've got that same scenario in the Pac-12 this week as UCLA, who has been on a tremendous roll at home, knocked off Washington, has won some big games and been very impressive indeed, beating Utah right to follow that up. Well, now they go on the road to Oregon, a really tough place to play. The Ducks, since their demolition in Atlanta against Georgia in the opening game, have really been piling up some nice wins. And you would say, okay, well, this sounds like another upset alert situation with UCLA. But look at the line on this game. Oregon is a 6-point favorite. It's kind of astounding, but Las Vegas sets odds not based on what their opinion is of what the score is going to be. They set these lines, as you've heard here on our series, based on what public perception is and what the anticipated amount of points or favorite is established will inspire action in those games. And in this situation, Oregon is a 6-point favorite, which is really remarkable, playing a UCLA team that has been outstanding so far, albeit the schedule until just the last couple of weeks not as tough, but they've been doing it at home. Now they've got to go on the road. So the pick here is Oregon, give the 6, Bo Nix and the Ducks to knock off UCLA. Hey, in the pro ranks, we've got a couple of games as well. The Baltimore Ravens have been playing a ridiculously tough schedule. They lost in a game they looked like they were on paper favored to win last week, but didn't get it done against the upstart New York Giants. They come home with an absolute must-win game to salvage their season. I don't think the Cleveland Browns are that good. They were one of Case's picks last week in the NFL and came up on the short side of the score. I think the Ravens can handle the Browns. 6.5 is a little high, but I'm going to give those points. and go that way. The Denver Broncos have been sputtering. You know, they acquired Russell Wilson and looked like they were all set on their offense to really put things together. But the Broncos have been a disaster. They have not been able to really generate any offense. If you watch the Monday night game, it was really an ugly game between the Chargers and the Broncos. Neither team could do much offensively, but Denver loses that game on a last-second field goal in overtime to the Chargers. One of these weeks, things have to click better for the Broncos. Their running game is in disarray since they lost Williams, their star running back. And apparently there's a little bit of friction going on with Melvin Gordon, who would be assumed to be the guy to step into that role. So now they're going with a rookie and the veteran Latavius Murray. But the Broncos come home and play the Jets, another team that has been on an unbelievably good roll because, let's face it, the Jets have been lousy for a long time. The Broncos are only a 1-point favorite. I think they've got to break through, and I'm not a believer in the Jet thing. In fact, and I'm not only taking the Broncos -1, but my final pick as we run out of time here is the Giants, who are going to Jacksonville to play the Jaguars, another team you'd think would be favored. They're not. Jacksonville's a 3-point favorite, and I think that's justified. So I'm going against both the New York teams. Take the Broncos -1 and the Jaguars -3. Kip Keefer batting for Case Keefer this week. Stay tuned. My SEC picks are next. Hey, everybody. Time for the SEC forecast for this week. Looking at the schedule, it's kind of light. Only 5 games involving SEC teams. Many clubs are on the bye week this week, getting ready for the stretch drive to the season. Hard to believe we are already at that point. It was a very important week last week in the league as far as putting some more of the many pieces together that comprise an SEC schedule. Of course, the biggest one was in Knoxville, Tennessee, beating Alabama in what a lot of people are calling an instant classic game. I'll give it classic marks in terms of the drama and the twists and turns, but the game was pretty sloppily played by both teams, particularly Alabama. 17 penalties, whether all of them were deserved or not. And Tennessee, as we've been saying all year, has a absolutely Cadillac offense, but really not a great defense. And that is going to be a big question mark going forward for the Volunteers. Alabama getting behind with turnovers and mistakes and penalties, easily came back and overtook the Volunteers before they found a way to kind of give it away and give Tennessee a victory with the exchange of late field goals, Reichert missing, and the Tennessee kicker with the ugliest kick in football history, knuckling his through. But it went through the uprights, and that's all that counts. Tennessee now on its way to big games in the next couple of weeks. And if they had a really strong opponent this week, or even a middle-of-the-road kind of team coming into Knoxville, this would be a good spot for a Tennessee letdown, but we don't get that opportunity because UT Martin is the opposition, and so that one is just a throwout of one of the games on the schedule. Tennessee does host Kentucky next week, and Kentucky is a team that we haven't been that high on this year. If you've listened to the show, we did have them last week against Mississippi State, and they are going to be going into Knoxville next week with not much to lose. Tennessee could be looking ahead to their trip to Georgia for a possible SEC Eastern Championship showdown. So we'll keep a close eye on the developments leading up to the Wildcats and the Volunteers next week in Knoxville. Kentucky is off this week to prepare for that game, which is another big factor. The games we do have, let's go to Tuscaloosa. Alabama licking their wounds, trying to bounce back. They know they've got to pretty much run the table now to be a factor in the national championship discussion. They can't have any more slip-ups, and it's not a great opportunity for them to have their first bounce-back game against Mississippi State, a team that has shown some flashes of being very, very good, both offensively and defensively. I thought it was a bad spot for them last week going to Kentucky after having two huge wins at home against Texas A&M and Arkansas, and Kentucky coming off a really bad loss to South Carolina, and it played out that way. Mississippi State really was not very good in that game, only scored one offensive touchdown, which for the Pirates' air raid offense is a pretty bad week overall. I thought the defense played pretty well for Mississippi State, and that's an element they have that a lot of people overlook. So I think this is going to be a competitive game. I think Alabama has to have it, and I think that's why the line is 21, which is about where you figured it would be. But Mississippi State is not a second-rate team. They are a team that has been very solid, but particularly in Starkville, so you can't get that excited about them on the road. But I still think that's too many points. I think Alabama wins the game in the 34-20 range. But that's not going to cover. I like Alabama, but I'm taking Mississippi State in the 21 points. The other big game is surprisingly in Baton Rouge. LSU's the Jekyll and Hyde team of the league. Brian Kelly trying to put his own stamp on the program in his first year. They were just abysmal 2 weeks ago. In their game against Tennessee, they gave the game away from the very beginning, turnovers, and couldn't execute anything offensively, couldn't complete a pass, basically. So that last week, they go to Florida. We say, okay, coming off that, LSU's not making much progress. Take the Gators. Bad mistake. LSU ran them out of their own building, and all of a sudden, Jaden Daniels found the magic of throwing the football to a great squad of wide receivers, including Bookie and Neighbors. They rolled up over 300 yards passing and beat Florida in Gainesville. Now come home to play Ole Miss, who's a top 10 team. So is this an upset alert? Well, it would be, but guess what? LSU's the favorite, not Ole Miss, not the top 10 undefeated team, the Ole Miss Rebels. LSU is actually a 1.5 point favorite, which speaks volumes of just how tough this league is when one of your alleged top teams is playing a team that's in the bottom half and is an underdog. All that being said, logically you say, well, Ole Miss the better team. It's a 1.5. I got to take the Rebels. From what I saw of the Ole Miss defense last week, Auburn just shredded them. Ole Miss's offense ran for over 400 yards. It looked like a game from the 70s where both teams were running the wishbone. Nobody could stop anybody on the ground. But I think that's a real alarm bell that Ole Miss's defense looked so bad in that game. So I'm going to take LSU in the 1.5. The other two games, neither are major pieces of the picture, I should say, in the league, but you've got Vanderbilt going to Missouri. Can we stop the talk of Vanderbilt being improved and their offense is so much better than in years past? They lost to Alabama 55-0. They lost to Georgia 55-3. This team is Vanderbilt. They're not improved. They're Vanderbilt. They'll always be Vanderbilt. And all of the hype that they were something different this year has been clearly disproven. They go play Missouri, who was playing good football, almost upset Georgia, and came very close to doing the same thing against Florida the next week. They had a bye week. Maybe they've got it together even more. Missouri is a slight favorite, slight 14 points against Vanderbilt. That's like a pick'em. I'm taking Missouri. I don't think Vanderbilt has anything to offer. And the other game is Texas A&M at South Carolina. Texas A&M has a better team. They've had a rough go, but they had a bye week after a close call against Alabama. They're better than the Gamecocks. I'm taking Texas A&M and giving the 3 points. That's the report for this week. Hope we go 4 for 4 and make you a big winner. I'm Kip Keefer. We will talk to you next week right here on Wanna Bet.